Hey everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold, back with our weekly lecture series. It's been a while. The lecture today is on the 46th USSR Chess Championship, which was held in 1978. It was held in Tbilisi, Georgia. I was in Georgia once, but I was in Batumi, which is, I think, the second biggest city in Georgia. Tbilisi is the capital and the biggest city. Want to thank our sponsor, Robert Olford. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture, you can contact my wife, Karen. Her details are in the description of the video. And you can sponsor a lecture on the topic of your choice. Unless the topic's crazy, then it's 50-50 then. A lot of countries are broke, and by countries, I mean their chess federation. Most chess federations of most countries don't have a lot of money, and so if they don't have a corporate sponsor, which typically they don't, that means the championship of the country doesn't have a lot of prize money. That's the way it was in the U.S. Until the St. Louis Chess Club came along. For example, in the 70s and 80s, in the U.S. championship, first prize was like $2,500. And now first prize is like $50,000. So corporate sponsors and patrons are important to have a national championship if you want it to be strong. So typically the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, etc., the strongest national championship was the USSR. I would say 90 to 95% of the top players in the Soviet Union would play in the Soviet Championship because it was so prestigious. And the other reason is, unlike today, if you were a Soviet grandmaster, it was unlikely you were allowed to leave the country. So, nowadays everybody just goes everywhere. But back in the day, it was rare for a Soviet grandmaster to play out of the country unless it was like Karpov or Korchnoi or Spassky. Somebody who was like top 10 in the world. They would be able to travel outside the country. But since the Soviet Union had, probably 200 grandmasters, if you were an average grandmaster, nobody wanted you, and the Soviet government wouldn't let you go because, they're afraid you'll leave. Which didn't stop Korchnoi. They let him go and he left. So why am I telling you this? What does this have to do with the Soviet Championship? Well, if you're a Soviet grandmaster and you want to play chess, you want to play in the Soviet Championship because you can't leave the country and play. So this is as good as it gets. And if you win the Soviet Championship, then some Western organizers might want you in the tournament and say you're the Soviet champion. That's pretty prestigious. For example, when Petrosian was the world champion, he couldn't win the Soviet championship. Man, Soviet championship, tough. Okay. Now, I don't know if the sponsor intentionally did this. It doesn't matter, but he may have. This Soviet championship, in particular, the one the sponsor, Mr. Olford, wants to talk about, was the debut of Garry Kasparov. And I know that Kasparov was born in 1963, and he was born in April. This tournament was in December of 1978. So therefore, Kasparov was 15 years old. And this was his first Soviet championship. And 15-year-olds don't play in the Soviet championship. That's how strong Kasparov was. Nowadays, 15 is quite a reasonable age. But 1978, good players weren't 15 years old. Okay, now on Wikipedia, they explain, which I already knew, but you guys probably didn't know. In the Soviet Union, the way they have the championship is they have qualifying tournaments. So some people get to the championship because, they're good, but most people get in by qualifying. They play in the, premier, they play in a secondary tournament where the top few players qualify. And this particular tournament, I think it was unusual, although I could be wrong, had two qualifying tournaments. And people qualified from both tournaments. One of the tournaments was a Swiss, June, July, with 64 players. And another tournament was a round robin, and people from both tournaments qualified to the final. Plus, they let in one of the top Georgian players because the tournament was held in Georgia. Now, you have to realize something so you're not confused. In 1970s, it was common for Westerners to refer to the Soviet Union as Russians, which, isn't true. Russia is one of the republics in the Soviet Union, but there's also Georgia and Latvia and Lithuania, and there's like between 15 and 20 republics. And so in the 1970s and before, the Soviet championship was very strong. And today, if you had the Russian championship, since the Soviet Union supposedly doesn't exist anymore, although I don't know, that wouldn't be as strong because you're not taking the top players from all the other republics, you're just taking Russians. So the Russian championship of the last 10, 20, 30 years isn't as strong as the Soviet championships because the Soviet championship encompasses a lot more people and land than just Russia. So, for example, in this tournament, there was a tie for first, and one of the people tying for first was Mikhail Tal. Mikhail Tal, former world champion, played for Latvia. So when they had Olympiads, he played for the Soviet Union because there was no Latvia in chess. There was the Soviet Union. So the Soviet teams from the 50s, 60s, and 70s had all world champions on their team. They had Smyslov and Tal and Botvinnik, and those were the weak players. Spassky, yeah. Okay, and the Soviet championship had players from all the republics and all the top players, and unlike most round robins, the people who came in last were really good. Like, if Gotham Chess is playing in a round robin, for example, and he does that, and let's say he's an IM, because he is, and let's say he's trying to get a GM norm, so he's one of the lower rated players, and he's one of the IMs, he's not a GM. And let's say he's not having a good tournament, and he comes in last. Okay, that's possible, that's happened. Okay, You might say, okay, Gotham Chess came in last. He's an IM. His rating's pretty low. That's a round robin. The people who are the lower rated players come in last. Okay. And what Gotham Chess is trying to do is get a GM norm and come in first. And then his rating would go up a lot and he'd get a GM norm. And then he'd have good content on his channel. Okay. In the Soviet Championship, if you came in last, you were really good. And it's possible you could have come in first. There wasn't any that guy, he shouldn't be playing in the Soviet Championship. Soviet Championship, the guys who came in last were famous grandmasters because everybody was. It's like a superstar tournament. Okay, now I don't want to talk about the qualifying tournaments because that's not really the topic of the lecture. The lecture is the Soviet Championship. So we're going to go down and they have the winners, Tal and Tseshkovsky. And this is the round robin and there's the Swiss. Okay. And then this is the final. This is in the Wikipedia article. This is the tournament that I'm lecturing about. It had 18 players. Now, if you're a typical player, then you're used to complaining when you play in a chess tournament. You're like, there's 2 rounds a day, and I have to eat my food in 30 minutes before the next round. And my opponent, I just looked at the pairings, and they're higher rated than I expected. And I got in time trouble, and I didn't know what the time control was. And I couldn't find a score sheet, and I couldn't find my board number, and all you do is complain. Okay, in the Soviet Championship, it's 18 players, and everybody plays everybody, and everybody's a strong grandmaster. So if you want to complain, you should play in those tournaments, because you're playing 17 rounds. God damn. The tournament takes almost a month. Okay? So next time you play in a weekend tournament and you're like, I had to play 3 games, okay? These people are playing 17 games and everybody they're playing is a famous grandmaster. So the tournament's tough. Okay, tied for first, Tal, who didn't lose a game, and Tseshkovsky. Tal was really good in the late 70s. This tournament was in 1978. And in 1979, in Montreal, Tal tied for first with Karpov. So Tal was on fire at the end of the 70s, even though he was world champion in the early 60s. Okay, so the cross table is on Wikipedia. You can go look at it. Just type in 46th USSR Chess Championship, or type in 1978 USSR Chess Championship, and Wikipedia has the cross table. And the people who came in last, Kuzman, Dorfman, Chukmakov, Razuvayev, Mikhalchishin, Timoshenko, Makarichev, that's the bottom of the cross table. Those are all strong grandmasters. I've heard of all of those players. And they actually all got a lot of points. People who came in last got 6 points out of 17. That's pretty good for last. Now, there's something funny, and I actually explained to you earlier why this was the case, but you guys weren't listening. In the cross table, they have the FIDE ratings of the players. And after Garry Kasparov's name, there's no rating. And you might be thinking, why doesn't he have a rating? And the reason is, which I explained earlier, is Soviets typically couldn't leave the country. So you weren't playing a lot of tournaments with a lot of FIDE rated players because people didn't get to leave the country and play chess. So if you have a group of players who are not FIDE rated, and they're all master strength, they're not going to get FIDE ratings. Nobody has a FIDE rating. But if you play in Europe, for example, if you're Russian, and tournaments are all FIDE rated, you get a FIDE rating. Kasparov hadn't played outside the Soviet Union. He was playing in tournaments in the Soviet Union where people didn't have FIDE ratings. So even though Kasparov was definitely grandmaster strength, he didn't have a FIDE rating. But he got one from this tournament because everybody he played was FIDE rated. And high, too. Okay. Kasparov tied for 5th place, which is pretty good for a 15-year-old with the top players in the Soviet Union. Also playing of note were Lev Polugaevsky. He got 3rd. Alexander Belyavsky was a candidate. He tied with Kasparov. Oleg Romanishin, he was a candidate. Efim Geller. Geller had a plus score against Fischer. Boris Gulko, one of the only people to be Soviet and American chess champion. I think he was the only one. And other players I named earlier, also very strong. Okay, so let's look at the games. Tournament was in Tbilisi, Georgia. And let me see, gotta do something. What I don't know. Okay. So I don't know how to pronounce Mikhalchishin's name. His first name's Adrian. And in fact, the first 2 games are his. I want to show a game by the 2 people who won, because that seems reasonable. And I also want to show a game of Kasparov, because that also seems reasonable. And then I figured that's enough. You guys barely heard of the other players. Okay, Tal's white. He's playing Mikhalchishin. And they played very sharp Botvinnik semi-Slav, which Kasparov became famous for in the early 80s for beating. They transposed into a semi-Slav Queen's Gambit. So there you go. Bishop g5. The other common move is e3. Also, g3 is sometimes played. Okay, and this is a very common pawn sacrifice white makes. And white played a4, which is unusual. Normally, white plays e5. And Tal has had white and black in this opening. A4 is unusual. Try to take your opponent out of preparation. I'm not sure in 1978 what kind of preparation these guys had in these sharp openings, which couldn't use engines with because there was no engine. Okay, bishop b4, pinning the knight, takes, e5. When white plays e5 in the semi-Slav, black plays h6, because black has to. And then g5, otherwise black loses a piece. White sacrifices a piece, because white's going to win the knight on f6. Knight bd7. Queen f3, putting more pressure on f6 and attacking the rook in the corner. Rook b8. Takes on f6. Now, typically, in these lines where white doesn't play a4 and black doesn't play c6, and then they traded on b5. So if you can imagine black has a pawn on c7 and white has a pawn on a2, typically in those lines, black castles queenside. You can see, no matter how good you are at chess, castling kingside seems risky. But Tal played queen f3, attacking Mikhalchishin's rook, and Adrian played rook b8. So black's not going to castle queenside, and it's unlikely black's going to castle kingside. because it looks crazy. And typically white castles kingside, and sometimes white's king is safe. Okay. So white's a pawn up, but white has isolated B pawn, isolated D pawn, doubled F pawns, and white's queen is going to get harassed by the bishop. And white's king is, knight is pinned. So it's complicated. Okay, bishop B7, queen G3, rook G8, bishop E2. This is sort of normal developing moves, reasonable. Queen B6, attacking the pawn on D4. Castles. Okay, so still white's a pawn ahead, and black has compensation with this rook on the G file, this beautiful bishop, this weak pawn on D4, the weak pawn on F6. But white's like, your king is on E8, dude. Bishop D6, attacking the queen. Queen H4. B4, attacking the knight. Knight goes to D1. The knight's not good on D1, but the knight is good on E3. Because that puts pressure on the C4 pawn, and it defends the G2 pawn, where black looks like has some counterplay. So knight D1, the knight wants to go to E3. Queen B5, attacking the bishop on G5. F4, defending the bishop. Queen D5, threatening queen takes G2 mate with advantage. Tall played bishop F3. Queen takes D4 check. Knight C5. Now material's equal. Queen H7, threatening queen takes rook. Rook F8. F5. White's trying to crash through in the center because Mikhalchishin's king is on E8. That's not safe. Bishop takes F3. Rook takes F3. Knight B3, attacking the rook on A1 in the corner. White sacrifices the exchange with obvious reason, always sack the exchange. And then plays knight E3. And even though black is up in exchange, white's king is super safe on H1, and black's king is going to be attacked the rest of the game. Queen E4, pinning the F pawn and the G pawn. Queen H5, unpinning the F pawn. Bishop C5, attacking the knight. Sacrifices by taking on E6. Complicated. Now, white is down a rook, but white is Mikhail tall. Rook E1, pinning the bishop. Now, I'd like to stop for a second and point something out to the crowd, which is sort of amazing. Tall, most of his life, played like tall. Makes sense, because that's who he is. And when you think of Mikhail Tal, you think sacrificing all his pieces, and mating attacks, and maybe the sacrifices are unsound, maybe they're not, and so forth. And what's surprising is that he played a lot of tournaments where he didn't lose any games. Because you would think with his style, he would win a lot and lose a lot. And he'd win more than he lost. That's why he was world champion. But in this tournament, for example, we can see how Tal's playing. Sacrifice the exchange on B3, sacrifice his knight on E3, pushing his center pawns, crazy like Fox News. And he didn't lose any games this tournament. Just had wins and draws. Kasparov, conversely, who has a similar playing style to Tal, he lost 3 games this tournament, although he was 15. So. Okay, rook b5, pinning the bishop. Both bishops are pinned to the queens, except Tal's down a rook. Queen d1, always retreat, threatening queen d7 mate with advantage. And I would assume if I had the black pieces that I overlooked queen d1. Now the bishop is hanging on e3 because there's no longer a pin on the white bishop. I guess I would play rook d5 here. Okay, rook d5. Good. Queen a1. The idea is if you take my bishop, I play queen a4 check and queen d7 mate. And the other idea is if you don't take my bishop, I'll take your bishop. That's the game? He took the bishop and got mated? Terrible. Let me see if that's the game or... Well, that is the game. Why would black get checkmated instead of just losing the normal game? I guess black was in terrible time trouble, but I don't understand why you would miss queen a4 check, queen d7 mate. I saw it without help of an engine. Okay, so that's how Tal won. Sacrificed all his pieces. Sacked on b3, sacked on e3, sacked on g5, and he had his king tucked away in the corner and eventually won. I guess this is why Mikhalchishin came near the bottom of the cross table. Can't see he's getting mated. Okay, the other winner of the tournament, in a surprise, was Vitaly Tseshkovsky. He tied for first also with Tal, and game I have that I thought was his best was also against Mikhalchishin. They played a funny-looking Berlin. I'm not even sure it is a Berlin. It's a funny-looking Berlin. I mean, that's the Berlin. Okay, now in this position, grandmasters play knight d6. That's 99% of grandmaster games. And the famous Berlin endgame that you all know about is bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes. And this position has occurred hundreds, if not thousands of times at the grandmaster level. Okay, but this was in 1978. So there was no Kasparov-Kramnik match yet. That was in 2000, I think. And Mikhalchishin played bishop e7, which I already don't know any theory of bishop e7. Okay, Tseshkovsky played queen e2, and now they played a Berlin without trading queens. But they got the same kind of position, it's just their queens on the board. And in the Berlin, I think it behooves black to trade queens. Otherwise, I think white gets an initiative. White can start attacking. So probably that's why people don't play bishop e7 anymore. Okay, knight d6. They played the Berlin moves. Took with the b pawn. And now there's no trading of the queens. So double-edged position where white has more space in the center and black has two bishops. Okay, queen e4, attacking the knight. G6, knight c3, Rook d1. White looks like he has a nice position. b8. Queen a4, threatening the a7 pawn. a6, sort of a silly move to make. b3, thwarting black's rook on b8. Rook b4, queen a5. Knight h4. Black's playing on both sides of the board. White plays in the center. Bishop a3. Black has the two bishops, and white says, no, don't have the two bishops. Tries to trade off a pair of bishops. Black's pawn structure on the king's side indicates black should have a dark squared bishop. So white wants to trade the dark squared bishop. So all these dark squares are weak near the black king. So now black no longer has the two bishops, and black has weak dark squares. Black's pawn structure on the queen's side is very suspicious. Queen g5, threatening checkmate in 1. g3, that's why he won the tournament, he saw it. Queen takes e5, sacrificing his knight on h4. So he takes it. To be perfectly honest, I don't see the compensation. I don't know why he sacrificed his knight. I don't know why he hung mate against Tall. So what do I know? c5. Okay, so this is a tactic. If the knight moves to a normal square, then the knight on c3 is hanging. So knight e2. Rook b4. Mikhalchishin wants to get his queen and rook over here. Compensation for a piece. Rook d3. White does a rook lift for defense, which you don't see very often. Rook takes h4, threatening queen takes h2. Knight g3. Bishop b7. Black has 3 pieces attacking. But I can't really explain any threats. I can't say black's threatening this and this. I don't see any black threats. I guess eventually black will have threats. Okay, rook d1, double up on the bubble up. d6. Queen a5, threatening c7 pawn. Black's position collapses. Queen f6. So I'm guessing black wants to play rook takes h2 and queen takes f2 check, but that looks crazy. Crazy enough it might work. King h3, bishop c8 check. Yeah, maybe it works. Yeah. Okay, I assume that's the point of queen f6, is to start attacking the white king. Knight d5, blocking the bishop. Attacks the f pawn. White ignores it. Knight e4, forking the queen and rook. More tactical mistakes from black in time trouble, and then black resigned. So black sacrificed a piece for an attack, didn't have enough attack, and lost the game. And what's funny is Mikhalchishin was taking pieces that Tall was sacrificing, then Tall mated him. So I guess that's why he didn't win the tournament. Okay, and last but not least, Garry Kasparov, and he's white against Polugaevsky. Polugaevsky was a famous Soviet grandmaster who wrote a lot of books also and was a great theoretician. Very famous book he wrote, I think, in the 80s called Grandmaster Preparation. And I think they made a sequel. In this event, this was the only game Polugaevsky lost. And Polugaevsky came in third by a point. So Polugaevsky was close to tying for first. But losing this game didn't help. This is the only game he lost to Garry Kasparov, the 15-year-old. Kasparov has played e4 and d4 in his career. And they played a sharp Sicilian, which Polugaevsky was known for. Kasparov sacrifices a pawn because he's Kasparov. Wants to open that bishop up. Also, black's development, pretty suspicious. Polugaevsky says, a pawn? I'll take a pawn. And he comes back. So it's just a straight pawn, but white has a lead in development. Black has no kingside development. And it's not clear where black's king is going to go in the future. Bishop h5, threatening, rook takes e6 check. If that's not a trying to learn tactic, I don't know what is. Bishop e7. So the idea is, if you take the pawn, it's not check. So black can play g6, and all of white's pieces are attacked. That's the idea. Okay, but he played rook takes e6 anyway. g6. And then he went back to e1, and he went from sacrificing a pawn to sacrificing a piece. Black played rook d8, attacking the queen. And then played c5, attacking the queen again. And then white attacked black's queen, confusing the audience. The bishop on h5 is still on pre. Queen b6, queen g3, and now he takes. So black's a piece ahead. Remember, 15-year-old Kasparov is white. Bishop c7, a fork. Queen g6. Black wants to trade queens because black's up a piece. So it makes sense. And black's king is on e8. Terrible. Takes, 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 takes. Black has two pieces for a rook, but black's king is still under attack. And black still is lacking in development. King c7, knight d5 check. You have to take it. Now, this is just terrible. Black has two pieces for a rook. White doesn't even have any pawns. But the h5 pawn doesn't look like it's long for this world. Black's other kingside pawns are isolated, and black can't develop his pieces. If black's rook is on h8 the whole game, what do you want him to do? h6, confusing the audience. There's a move I never would have thought of. Rook takes h5. Rook h7. e5, threatening to get his two pieces for a rook back. Threatening the f pawn. So now white has a pawn and a rook for the two pieces. So that should be about equal in an endgame. White activates his rooks. Black's knight still hasn't moved this game. Not as soon as I say it. White coordinates his rooks. Now he has two pawns. If black plays knight e5, forking the rooks, then rook d6 check. Wins the bishop on f6. So bishop e7, rook e3, again trying to get the two pieces back for the rook. And now white has a 3-1 pawn majority on the king side. So white tries to make a queen on the king side. Also takes advantage of the e5 square, stopping black from going there. c4, explosive, threatening bishop c5. Trade some pawns. And white just has too many pawns. And black blunders the knight and resigns. Didn't see rook f5 check. So that was a 15-year-old Kasparov playing super tactically against Polugaevsky, eventually getting to an endgame that I think was equalish, and then outplaying Polugaevsky in the equal endgame with getting his rooks active. Black never got his pieces coordinated. They're all over the board. Anyway, that was the 1978 Soviet Championship. I want to thank our sponsor again, Robert Olford. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture, contact Karen. Her details are in the description of the video. And we'll have more weekly lectures now that I'm feeling better. And we could lecture on any topic of your choice, including the 1978 Soviet Championship. No, we just did that. So pick another Soviet championship. Soviet championships were really strong, and the best players in the Soviet Union always wanted to play so they could test themselves against the best players. And this tournament, Kasparov did so well, he got a FIDE rating. Yay. Go Kasparov. Okay, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye.